Matters strategic and military now. I'm joined on the desk by Catherine McGregor, who's a freelance commentator, now a regular Sky News commentator, of course, former military officer. Catherine, welcome to the desk.
Great to be here, and big shout out to Jim Molan too, by the way. It's great to see him back. Really,
yeah.
It was great to see him back in the Senate.
He's seen some pretty difficult battles in his time, but few of them would have been as tough as the one to get through the New South Wales Liberal Party back into the Senate.
Navigating the moderate wing of the New South Wales Libs to come back from where he was pretty impressive.
Almost as tough as what he confronted in Fallujah. No, I don't want to be too flippant, but yeah, it was a tough battle. Now, Catherine, incredible story from Jeff Chambers on the front page of The Australian today. I suppose it's to be expected, but the Australian military, the ADF, going full on when it comes to robots and sophisticated weaponry. There's a lot of technology here. We see sort of robotic dogs and soldiers, almost Terminator-style technology. This is the trend for armed forces around the world, isn't it? To put machinery where people used to go.
Absolutely correct. A couple of the points. First off, it was a great get from Jeff Chambers, and it just shows you the value of good forensic journalism. He's dug out a defence tender, done his homework and joined up the dots and worked out that there's programs and developmental looks at AI, artificial intelligence.
Yep.
Chris, just to try to make this, so we don't go into geekery and drive your audience mad here, artificial intelligence is not, the future is not going to be robots fighting robots and no human beings. Humans will always be in warfare at the decision-making level. AI is still in a developmental phase. It is becoming increasingly important and relevant, but the essentials of war have always been the following: to find and to kill your enemy. What the Yanks call in their jargon now the sensor-shooter link. And all of the development that has gone on since that first Gulf War, that impressive Schwarzkopf-Colin Powell show that you remember with precision-guided munitions and so on, people sat back and went, my goodness, the future's here and how terrifying it is. We have gone quantum leaps forward on AI, so it is called. But just to keep it in perspective, the Australian Tax Office uses AI, artificial intelligence. It's essentially pattern recognition. If you go to your skin specialist and they run a machine over you to track your body freckles and lesions to see whether you've got skin cancer, that's AI. All it is, it's a replication of the human neural system reduced to technology. It still has vulnerabilities. It is not perfect. And some AI systems are very vulnerable when they operate outside the system in which they're trained into this highly routinized processing information. But what Army are doing is very important, and it is as follows. They're trying to equip the individual soldier with artificial intelligence systems that give them a greater sense of the environment they're in, help them to distinguish, say, plant and animal life from humans without direct eyes on these potential targets. And it also is an attempt to fuse information throughout the battle space. And also, final thing, it is to robotically use certain platforms. It's to have guns that don't require people to fire them, and to have armoured fighting vehicle systems that will be robotic. And that future is very rapidly approaching us.
So we know about drones, and there'll be remotely controlled vehicles as well. We've seen that sort of technology, of course, with bomb disposal. Most people are familiar with that.
Absolutely.
You talk about the first Gulf War. By the latter stages of the second Gulf War, the Iraq War, we saw soldiers going into battle. They might have night vision. They certainly have telecommunications going direct into their ear. There's satellite positioning.
Absolutely.
So you're having humans surrounded by a lot of this intelligence.
Absolutely.
How far off are we from actually having what looks like a robot going into a battle situation where the human is completely removed, back in a control centre or the like?
Your point's well made. For instance, we talk about unmanned aerial vehicles or drones, shorthand. Drones actually have a bigger crew than a fighter aircraft or most of the AWACS, in that you've got a ground team to keep it operating. We're very close to having totally unmanned systems. That future's pretty rapidly here. Linking to what has been going on the show this morning to your audience, what worries me the most is how far China is leaping ahead in this area. They made AI a national strategic objective this year. They released a policy statement.
So this is a new arms race.
They're calling it the AI arms race already. And this, for the geeks in your audience, grab the American magazine Foreign Affairs, the April edition. There's a special edition dedicated to where the top 7 nations are in terms of developing AI systems. China has stolen a march on the US because the US has had its eye off the ball in these intensive ground campaigns in the Middle East. Now, the US is never to be underestimated, but a lot of its legacy defence systems, these highly expensive platforms, aircraft carriers, stealth bombers and so on, which are going to become very vulnerable to AI, because what AI will do is allow you to deploy mass, cheap systems and operate swarming. So you might have an expensive stealth bomber, but you can throw 300 cheap drones at it. Or you might have an aircraft carrier and you punch out 50 pretty low tech, or sorry, AI, but not particularly expensive barges against it. China has stolen a march on that, and that is a real concern to me as we go forward. And the US procurement program is tied to the geopolitics of states. And you've got certain very powerful representatives, and we've seen a little bit of it in failures in our own procurement, where too often electoral politics dictates the location and the tendering processes for platforms, submarine being the case in point.
Yeah, see, this conversation could go on and on, because those strategic issues and the competition are incredible. Then you talk about every time you shoot down one of these, of course, they'll be pulling it apart to try and replicate it, get that intellectual property. But then you're talking about, we've got a submarine project that's going for 30, 40 years. Are these big chunky submarines virtually obsolete by the time they're built? But let me just go on to a couple of issues then that I think are applicable to the Australian ADF now, upscaling in this area. One is recruitment. Maybe this makes it easier to recruit people because it's seen as such an intellectually challenging area, and you're not so much a foot soldier on the front line, but someone controlling devices from a safer location. And maybe in that way, even though the equipment itself is expensive, maybe it's actually cheaper for armies because you have fewer human resources to train and develop.
It raises all of those prospects, Chris, indeed. What it does, it will allow humans to operate at a higher level of abstraction. There will be swarming platforms in much greater volume, less expensive than the high-tech stuff that's currently on the battlefield. The human being in the kill chain will be able to make more ethical decisions, which, you know, the lovies on the left who I noticed were accusing Jim of being a war criminal when he came back to the Senate yesterday, very kindly.
Lovely.
Lots sweet of them. The human beings will be able to operate more of these systems at a higher level of abstraction, gives them more time to make ethical, moral decisions. I think you're right. This will appeal to millennials, I suspect. I don't want to stereotype them too much, but I think there's a generation of people out there who are natives amongst this technology, who will be drawn to careers in this. The interesting point is going to be, and this is, we will never engineer out of warfare, in my view. I'm what's called a Clausewitzian traditionalist on this stuff. I believe in the human factor in war always being decisive. I believe war will always ultimately be decided on the ground by human beings, and that there will always be a role for violent conflict between, and I'm going to be anti-PC, between men, because ground combat will mainly be a male domain. However, what this will do is change the recruiting. The Myers-Briggs profile, I think, now is out of date, but the neural diversity required to operate these systems is going to appeal to a totally different type of human being. The big chunky guys, your Ben Roberts-Smiths and your Jim Molins, big guys that you need and will always need them.
But we're going to have guys sitting in their jocks in their mum's basement playing computer games who might end up...
That might be the person we need. We find someone who is literally quite neurally diverse and may not fit the normal recruiting image that... So
might be useful, but it also scares me a little bit. Thanks for joining us, Catherine.